Evan Carter walked into the clinic with the kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't fix, the kind that lived in the spaces between his ribs and in the corners of his mind, where memories sat like shadows, too heavy to move and too familiar to ignore. And as the automatic glass doors slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, he felt for a brief second as if the outside world had been muted. No car horns, no footsteps, no constant background noise of a city that never really cared whether he was holding it together or falling apart. Just the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant murmur of voices behind closed doors. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the check-in card the receptionist had given him, the paper already warm from his skin, and tried to ignore the way his heart was beating just a little too fast for someone who was supposedly fine. He had told himself a dozen times on the drive over that this was just a checkup, that it was no big deal, that real men didn't break down just because they were tired and sad and couldn't breathe at 3 a.m. But the truth was that every step he took down the hallway felt like a confession he hadn't agreed to make. The receptionist had called it a routine mental health assessment, the kind the clinic recommended for patients who had reported stress, insomnia, or recurring anxiety. And Evan had smiled awkwardly and joked about how being a single dad came with all 3 as a package deal. But the joke had landed heavily in his own chest. As he reached room 3 and saw his name printed on a small white label taped to the door, something in him hesitated. Not his body, which kept moving out of habit, but the softer, quieter part of him that still believed that if he stayed busy enough, he wouldn't have to feel. He knocked once out of reflex, then opened the door, and inside, the room surprised him. It wasn't the harsh, sterile white he expected. Instead, it was washed in warm tones, the soft beige of the walls, the gentle glow of a floor lamp by the corner, the faint scent of something like lavender or chamomile lingering in the air, and a cushioned chair facing a small desk, beside which stood a second chair angled slightly toward his, as if inviting conversation. He stepped in, closed the door halfway behind him without thinking, and stood there for a second, unsure where his hands should go, unsure if he was supposed to sit or wait. The door clicked softly as it swung shut on its own, and a moment later, it opened again as a woman entered, wearing light blue scrubs and a name tag that read Nora Hale, RN. She had calm, steady eyes and a tiredness around them that didn't look defeated, just lived in, like someone who had heard too many stories and still somehow carried each one with a kind of care. "Evan Carter?" she asked gently, even though they both could see his name on the chart. He nodded. "Yeah, that's me." She smiled, the kind of small, reassuring smile that didn't feel fake. "Hi, Evan. I'm Nora. I'll be doing your assessment today. It'll be just a checkup, nothing dramatic." The words, "just a checkup," should have been comforting, but instead they slid over him like water on cold glass, not sinking in anywhere. He forced a smile in return. "Sure, sounds good." He moved toward the chair, sat down, and noticed how his knee immediately began to bounce up and down, an old habit he thought he'd unlearned. As Nora stepped fully into the room, she reached back, turned the lock on the door with a soft, final click, and let the silence settle around them. "The door locks automatically during mental health assessments," she explained, her tone still gentle. "It's just for privacy. Just you and me now." Just you and me now. The phrase echoed in his chest in a way he didn't expect, and he felt suddenly, sharply aware of how alone he really was, how there was no one else here to deflect attention onto. No little voice tugging at his sleeve asking for a snack. No boss waiting for a report. No neighbor asking how school drop-off was going. For once, there was no distraction. just Evan. And he didn't know if he was ready for that. He sat up a little straighter, as if posture could disguise what habits, sleepless nights, and grief had carved into him. Evan Carter was 33 years old and already felt like most of his life had happened to him, not with him. 3 years ago, his wife, Maya, had died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The kind of day people forget, except for the ones whose lives are split into before and after by a single phone call. Since then, his world had narrowed to two main tasks: keep a roof over their heads and make sure his daughter, Lily, smiled more days than she cried. Everything else, his own feelings, his own fears, his own needs, had been shoved to the bottom of a box in his mind, taped shut and stuffed into a dark corner. Only lately, the box had started rattling. The first panic attack had hit him 6 months ago, at night, long after he had read Lily a story and watched her drift to sleep with her hand still clutching her stuffed rabbit. He had been standing in the kitchen, staring at a sink full of dishes, thinking about how he had forgotten to pay the electricity bill on time, and suddenly his chest had tightened like a fist closing from the inside. His heart had hammered against his ribs, his fingers had gone numb, and the room had tilted slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to convince him that something terrible was happening. He had slid down the cabinets to the floor, gasping, pressing a shaking hand to his sternum, and whispering, "Not now. Please not now." Because he wasn't sure if he was talking to his own body, or to God, or to whoever wrote the rules for single fathers trying to survive on one paycheck and leftover hope. It passed eventually, leaving him sweaty and exhausted, and he had decided never to think about it again. But it came back, and then it came back again. When the clinic recommended a mental health checkup after he'd mentioned his trouble sleeping during a routine physical, he had laughed it off at first, then booked the appointment late at night when the house was quiet, and he no longer trusted his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Now he was here, sitting in a warm room with soft light, and a nurse whose eyes seemed to see through the excuses he hadn't even spoken yet. Nora sat down opposite him, crossing one ankle over the other, making herself small in the space rather than looming over him. She didn't pick up her pen, didn't stare at her clipboard. She just looked at him, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that said, "I am here, and I am paying attention." "So," she began, "let's start simple. How have you been feeling lately?" Evan's first instinct, the one built from years of polite conversation and social autopilot, rose up instantly. "I'm fine. Just busy. You know, single dad life." He almost said it, but the word fine felt like sand in his mouth, gritty and useless. He swallowed. "I've been tired," he finally said, picking the safest complaint. "Working a lot, long hours. It's nothing new." "What do you do?" Nora asked. "HVAC technician," he replied automatically. "Heating, cooling, that kind of stuff. Lots of calls, lots of emergencies. People freak out when their AC dies." "I bet," she said with a small smile. "Do you like the job?" He shrugged. "It pays. I'm decent at it. That's enough, I guess." "And outside of work?" she asked. "What fills your time when you're not fixing other people's air?" The question caught him off guard. "My daughter," he said without hesitation, because that answer was always easy. "Lily. She's 6. School, homework, bedtime stories, negotiating over vegetables, that sort of thing." "Sounds like a handful," Nora said. "In a good way." The corner of his mouth lifted at that. "Yeah, she's everything." Nora nodded slowly, letting the lull stretch for a moment before she asked, "And what about you, Evan? Outside of being a dad and being a technician, what is there?" He blinked. The question might as well have been asked in another language. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said gently, "who are you when you're not fixing things and taking care of someone else?" He stared at her. The answer stuck like a stone in his throat. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then let out a dry little laugh that didn't sound like amusement. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't really have time for anything else." "When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" Nora asked quietly. There it was, the question that made his chest tighten in a different way, not with panic this time, but with a kind of aching awareness. He tried to think. Before Lily's last school project, before the overtime calls, before the anniversaries he tried not to acknowledge. "I don't remember," he said finally, and the honesty of that answer felt heavier than any lie would have. Nora's gaze softened. "How long have you been having the episodes?" "Episodes," he repeated, as if trying the word on. "The panic, the tight chest, the racing heart." He shifted in his seat. 6 months, maybe a little longer. I don't really keep track. Feels like they blur together." "How do they start?" she asked. He rubbed his palms against his jeans, feeling the roughness of the fabric. "It's random," he said, then corrected himself. "No, that's not true. It's usually at night, after Lily's asleep, when the house is quiet." Quiet. That was when the thoughts got loud. "Describe what you feel," Nora urged gently. "If you can." He exhaled slowly. "My chest gets tight, like someone put a band around it and keeps pulling. My heart starts pounding. I feel like I can't get enough air, even though I know I'm breathing. My hands go numb sometimes. My head starts spinning with all these what-ifs that don't make sense. Like, what if something happens to me and Lily's alone? What if I mess up everything? What if I just stop being able to keep it together?" He swallowed hard, his throat burning. "Sometimes I think I'm having a heart attack. Sometimes I think I'm just losing it." "Have you told anyone about this?" Nora asked. He shook his head, embarrassment flushing under his skin. "Who would I tell? My friends drifted after Maya died. They didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to say, so it just faded. My parents live in another state. We talk on holidays. My co-workers think I'm the guy who always takes the extra shift. And Lily is 6. I'm not going to tell her dad's freaking out in the kitchen at night." "So you've been carrying this alone," Nora said, not as an accusation, but as a simple, devastating fact. Evan looked at the floor. "It's not like I had a choice." "You always have a choice when it comes to your own pain," she replied softly. "You can hide it, or you can share it." He gave a humorless half-smile. "Sharing it doesn't make the bills go away, or magically give me more hours of sleep." "No," she agreed, "but it might make the weight less crushing." He didn't respond, but the words lodged somewhere inside him, in that overcrowded box he kept sealed. Nora reached for the clipboard now, but still didn't write anything. "You mentioned your wife on your intake form," she said. Even the word wife made his chest tug, like an old wound prodded with gentle fingers. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maya. She died 3 years ago." "Do you talk about her often?" Nora asked. Evan shrugged, his shoulders tightening. "Not really. People get uncomfortable. They don't know whether to say her name or pretend she never existed. So I just don't bring her up." "And you?" Nora asked. "Do you feel uncomfortable saying her name?" He looked up at the ceiling, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "Sometimes." There was a silence then, not empty, but dense. Nora didn't rush to fill it. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and said, "Evan, can I ask you something a little more direct?" He managed a small nod. "When you think about those nights, the panic, the tight chest, the racing heart, if we stripped away the symptoms and just asked the feeling behind them, what would it be?" He frowned faintly. "What do you mean?" "Fear, guilt, anger, loneliness," she offered. The words rolled through the room like fragile glass beads, each one reflecting something he didn't want to see. He thought about finding Maya's old scarf in a drawer a week ago and sitting on the floor with it in his hands for 20 minutes, without realizing he was shaking. He thought about Lily asking, in a small voice, why Daddy didn't laugh like he used to. He thought about standing in front of the bathroom mirror at midnight, seeing the dark circles under his eyes, and wondering how much longer he could pretend he was not unraveling. "All of it," he said hoarsely. "I feel all of it. Fear that something will happen to me and Lily will have no one left. Guilt that I'm not doing enough, even when I'm breaking myself trying. Anger that she's gone and I'm still here. And loneliness that doesn't go away even when I'm in the same room as my daughter, because I'm so busy being Dad I forget I'm also just Evan." His voice cracked on his own name, like he wasn't used to saying it without it being attached to someone else's needs. Nora's eyes didn't change. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. "Thank you for saying that out loud," she said. "That takes strength." He scoffed softly. "Doesn't feel like strength." "Strength isn't not feeling," she replied. "Strength is letting yourself feel and still choosing to show up tomorrow." The words hit him harder than he expected. His fingers curled into fists on his knees, not out of anger, but because something inside him was shaking loose, like that taped-up box in his mind had finally been pulled from the shadows and set on the table between them. He didn't mean to, but his eyes burned, and a blurred shimmer edged his vision. He cleared his throat, looked away, tried to swallow it down, the way he always did when Lily's eyes were on him. But here, there was no small face watching, no one who needed him to be invincible. There was just Nora, and her calm voice, and the locked door, and the quiet invitation to stop pretending. "Hey," Nora said softly, noticing the slight tremble in his jaw. "You're safe here. You don't have to hold it in." He shook his head automatically. "I'm not—" His voice faltered. The lie wouldn't exit the way it usually did. He exhaled, a shaky, uneven breath, and when he tried to blink away the moisture in his eyes, one tear slipped free anyway, tracing a slow, unfamiliar path down his cheek. He stared at the floor, ashamed and relieved all at once. No one had seen him cry since Maya's funeral. Not really. He had teared up in the dark sometimes, lying in bed alone. But even then he'd muffled his sounds with the pillow, as if there were still someone there to disturb. Here, in this small, warm room, with its locked door, his grief and fear and exhaustion finally had nowhere else to go, but out. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, voice raw. "I know how to work extra shifts. I know how to pack lunches and braid hair badly and pretend everything's fine at school pickup. But I don't know how to fall apart without breaking everything." Nora's reply was quiet but steady. "Maybe today isn't about falling apart," she said. "Maybe it's about letting someone hold the pieces with you for a while." He closed his eyes, a tear slipping from the corner of one and then another. The sound of his own breathing filled the room, uneven at first, then slowly sinking with the guidance of Nora's soft instructions as she taught him how to take deeper, calmer breaths. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, Exhale for 6. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel the chair supporting you. Feel the present moment instead of the 1,000 catastrophes your mind keeps rehearsing. He listened, followed, focused on the air moving in and out, until his pulse began to slow and the tightness in his chest loosened by a fraction. When he finally opened his eyes, the room looked the same, but he felt slightly different, as if someone had opened a small window in a house that had been sealed shut for years. Nora was still there, still watching him with that same steady attention. She hadn't looked away when he cried. She hadn't looked uncomfortable. She had just stayed. "You did well," she said simply. "You wrote it out." He sniffed, wiped a hand quickly over his face, embarrassed by the evidence of his tears. "That was a lot," he muttered. "Yeah," she agreed. "Because you've been holding a lot. Alone, for a long time." He stared at her, and for the first time in a very long time, he let the idea sink in that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep doing that forever. Maybe this locked door wasn't a trap. Maybe it was a boundary that kept the rest of the world out long enough for him to begin to reclaim the parts of himself he had buried beneath duty and survival. As the session continued, Nora asked about his routines, his sleep, his thoughts before bed, the waves of guilt that washed over him whenever he thought about taking even a single hour for himself instead of dedicating it to Lily. She didn't rush him when he stumbled over words, didn't press when his voice went quiet, just waited. And somehow, in that waiting, more of the truth found its way out. He talked about the anniversary of Maya's death and how he pretended it was just another day because he didn't know how to mourn without scaring his daughter. He admitted that sometimes he walked past the closed door of the bedroom that used to be theirs and felt physically unable to turn the knob. He confessed that more than once he had stood in the doorway of Lily's room watching her sleep and wondered if he was enough, if she would grow up resenting him for all the ways he was sure he was failing. Through it all, Nora didn't try to fix his life with platitudes. She offered practical tools, grounding exercises, the idea of scheduling even small moments in the week that were for Evan and not for Dad. Or employee or problem solver, the suggestion of a longer-term therapist he could see to unpack the grief and pressure without the time limit of a single appointment. But more than tools, she offered presence. At one point, near the end of the session, when his voice had grown hoarse and his posture had slumped from the effort of so much honesty, she said something that lodged in him like a gentle anchor. "Evan," she said, "your daughter doesn't need a perfect father. She needs a father who is alive and present. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's how you stay." The word "stay" struck something deep in him, the part that had been secretly afraid that one day, the panic, the exhaustion, the isolation would finally pull him under and he wouldn't be able to climb back out. He hadn't thought of self-care as a way of staying. He'd thought of it as a luxury he didn't deserve. Now, hearing it framed as survival, as love, made something shift. When the session time finally neared its end, Nora glanced at the clock and then back at him. "I know this was a lot for one day," she said. "We're not done. We barely scratched the surface. But I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up." He nodded, feeling wrung out but strangely lighter. "Okay. If we met again next week, same time, same room, what would you want to walk in here, having done for yourself, even if it's something small?" He thought for a moment. The instinct to say nothing, I didn't have time, flickered, but he pushed past it. Something small, something for himself. The image that came to mind was unexpectedly simple. sitting on the park bench while Lily played on the swings, instead of standing to the side, checking work emails, actually feeling the sun on his face and the breeze, maybe even bringing a book he'd been meaning to read for months. I think, he cleared his throat. There's a park near our apartment. Lily likes the swings. I usually just stand there and think about all the things I should be doing. Maybe I could sit on the bench, just for a bit. Maybe read a few pages of something. I don't remember the last time I read something that wasn't a bill or a maintenance manual. Nora's smile was genuine, warm. That sounds like a beautiful start, she said. Would you be willing to try that? He nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I could try. Good, she replied. And when you come back, if you choose to come back, you can tell me how it felt. Not whether you did it perfectly, just how it felt to give yourself a moment. The idea of a next time felt both daunting and comforting. He wasn't sure how he felt about committing to more sessions, more digging into the parts of himself he'd kept buried. But the fact that the option existed, that there was a place where he could walk in and not have to be fine, was quietly revolutionary. Nora stood then, and he followed her lead, his legs a little stiff from sitting so long. She walked to the door, hand resting on the lock. Before she turned it, she looked back at him and said, "Evan, I'm proud of you. Coming here, talking openly, letting yourself feel. That's not weakness. That's courage." His throat tightened again, but this time, the emotion didn't scare him as much. He let it rise and fall like a wave. "Thank you," he said softly, the words small but sincere. She unlocked the door with a soft click, and suddenly the muffled sounds of the clinic filtered back in. The ring of the phone at the front desk, the distant rumble of footsteps, the everyday rhythm of a world that had no idea what had just shifted inside this small room. Evan stepped out into the hallway, the air cooler here, the lights brighter. For a moment, he just stood there, letting himself adjust. His life hadn't miraculously transformed in an hour. The bills were still waiting. The long workdays were still ahead. The grief of losing Maya still lived inside him, not erased, not overwritten. But there was also something else now. Subtle, but real. The knowledge that he was not completely alone inside his own head anymore, that there was at least one person who knew he was struggling and didn't turn away. As he walked towards the exit, his phone buzzed with a text from the neighbor who had picked Lily up from school that day, a picture of his daughter grinning with missing front teeth, holding up a crooked paper crown she'd made in class. The sight made his chest ache with a different, softer kind of emotion. Love, sharp and overwhelming. He typed back a quick thank you, then slipped the phone into his pocket. On his way out of the building, he passed the small park across the street that he usually ignored, its swings swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, empty for the moment. He paused on the sidewalk, looking at it, and for the first time, instead of thinking, "I don't have time for that," he thought. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe after school. Maybe we'll stop there, and I'll sit on the bench, and I'll let myself be a man in the sun, not just a shadow chasing tasks. As he stepped into the bright light outside, the warmth on his face felt different than it had that morning. He couldn't name the feeling exactly, but it was somewhere between relief and possibility, as if a locked door had closed behind him while another, inside him, had quietly opened. He adjusted the strap of his worn work bag on his shoulder, took a deeper breath than he had in days, and began the walk back to his car, carrying with him not just the weight of responsibility, but also the fragile, unfamiliar hope that maybe healing didn't have to be something he faced alone. That night, after dinner dishes were stacked in the sink and Lily's backpack lay open on the couch, spilling crayons and worksheets. Evan stood at the living room window, staring toward the dark outline of the neighborhood park a few blocks away, and wondered when he had last chosen to go somewhere simply because it made him feel human instead of more productive. Lily slid into the room in her socks, almost colliding with his legs as she thrust a drawing up at him, her eyes bright. "Daddy, look," she said. "It's us at the park. You're pushing me on the swing and I'm flying way up." He took the paper, felt his throat tighten at the crayon version of himself with his arms outstretched, smiling under a crooked sun, and for a second, he saw the difference between the man on the page and the man standing here, carrying too many invisible weights. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "Can we go there tomorrow?" she asked, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. His old instinct rose immediately, mentally scrolling through repairs, errands, overtime, telling himself there wasn't time. But Nora's words from the clinic brushed against his thoughts. "Your daughter needs a father who is alive and present." "Yeah," he heard himself say. "After school we'll go." The next afternoon they did, the air cool and clear, the swings squeaking softly in the breeze as Lily ran ahead, calling back for him to hurry. He pushed her until his arms ached, listening to her laughter cut clean through the noise in his head. And when she ran off to the slides, he sat down on a faded green bench instead of pacing beside the play structure, feeling the wooden slats press against his shoulders, feeling his feet steady on the ground. For a long moment, he did nothing but breathe and watch his daughter play, and the world didn't fall apart. Later, when the familiar tightness crept into his chest in the middle of the night, he lay on his back in the dark and tried the breathing Nora had shown him. In for 4, hold, out for 6. Imagining the clinic room, the soft lamplight, the way she had stayed with him when he cried. The panic still came, but this time it rose and then ebbed like a wave, and he rode it instead of drowning. A week later, he walked back into room 3. His hands were still rough and tired, but they shook less as he sat. Nora stepped in, offered the same gentle, "Hi, Evan," and he was surprised by the small, honest answer that came out of him. "Hey," he said. "I'm glad to be back." She asked about the park, about sleep, about the small promise he had made to himself, and he found himself telling her about the bench, about the guilt that had pricked at him, and then loosened when he saw that Lily didn't care how much money he had made that day, or how many hours he'd worked. She just cared that he had shown up. "Maybe I've been measuring the wrong things," he admitted. "Maybe," she agreed softly. "Progress isn't always big. Sometimes it's a dad sitting on a bench instead of standing 3 steps away in his head." They talked about his nights, about the moments when the old fear still rushed in, and she helped him notice the difference between then and now. Back then, the panic had felt like an ambush. Now, he could at least recognize its footsteps. She taught him a few more tricks, a way to notice 5 things he could see, 4 he could touch, 3 he could hear when his thoughts spiraled too fast. And each tool felt like a small light switched on in a hallway he had always walked in the dark. He asked her, haltingly, why she did this work, how she sat with so many people's hurt without collapsing under it. And when she shared a little of her own story, about a brother she had lost young, about the years she had spent pretending it didn't affect her, he heard his own reflection in her words and believed her when she said, "It doesn't break me to hear your pain. It helps me to know mine wasn't pointless." The sessions did not magically cure him. He still had mornings when he woke up with his jaw clenched and his shoulders already braced for impact. He still had evenings when he stood outside the door of the bedroom that had once been his and Maya's and couldn't bring himself to go in. But alongside the panic and the grief, something else began to grow. The memory of being in that warm, quiet room with the locked door, where someone met his fear with steadiness and didn't ask him to apologize for it. He went back a third week, and a fourth. Some days he talked about Maya, about the way her laughter had filled their small apartment like sunlight, and how sometimes now the silence felt almost violent. Other days he talked only about practical things, work schedules, car trouble, Lily's reading homework, and Nora listened just as intently, as if the mundane details mattered too. Bit by bit, the version of himself who had sat stiff and guarded in that chair the first day began to soften around the edges. One rainy afternoon, running late from a call, he almost canceled his appointment. His fingers hovered over the clinic's number, but instead of dialing, he remembered the first time Nora had said, "You're safe here," and he turned his truck toward the clinic anyway. When he walked in, damp and apologetic, she simply handed him a tissue for the raindrops on his face and said, "I'm glad you still came." It was such a small sentence, but it lodged in him with disproportionate weight. After a month, if someone had asked him what had changed, he wouldn't have spoken about a dramatic transformation. Instead, he would have described tiny, almost invisible shifts. The way he caught himself saying, "I'm exhausted," instead of, "I'm fine," when his neighbor asked how he was. The way he paused at the park bench and sat down without arguing with himself about whether he deserved it. The way the panic still came, but no longer convinced him he was dying every time. And always, threading through those shifts, was the memory of a nurse locking a door and saying, "Just you and me now," and meaning, for once in his life, that the world could wait while he learned how to feel again. On a crisp morning at the start of a new season, he and Lily walked to the park under a sky washed clean by overnight rain. She ran ahead, as always, and he followed, slower, but less weighed down. As she climbed and shouted and laughed, he sat on the familiar bench, a paperback open but forgotten in his hands, and let himself simply exist. For the first time in a long time, his chest felt not empty and not overflowing, but spacious, like a room with the windows open and the curtains stirring gently in a breeze. He knew bad nights would still come. He knew grief did not expire on a schedule. But he also knew something he hadn't known the day he first walked into the clinic, that healing wasn't a finish line. It was this: showing up, breathing through the hard moments, letting someone else see you at your most unguarded, and discovering you were still worthy of care. As he watched his daughter pump her legs on the swing, hair flying, a wild, joyful streak of motion against the pale sky, Evan felt the quiet, solid truth settle inside him. He was still a single dad, trying to hold a life together with more love than resources. Still a man learning how to live with panic instead of pretending it didn't exist. Still a widower who missed his wife so much some days it felt like his bones remembered her. But he was also something else now. A person who had walked into a room, heard a lock click behind him, and chosen, for the first time in years, not to run from himself. And that choice, he realized, might just be the bravest thing he had ever done. And weeks later, on an ordinary Thursday evening when the sky was turning the soft color of peach and smoke, Evan found himself standing outside the clinic again. Not because he was falling apart, but because he finally understood that healing wasn't something you only sought in crisis. He pushed open the door, nodded at the receptionist, and walked the familiar hallway with a steadier step than the first time. When Nora opened the door to room 3, her warm, calm smile greeted him as if no time had passed at all. "Rough week?" she asked gently. He shook his head. Not rough, just real, he said, and the quiet pride in his voice surprised him. They talked, not about panic attacks or crushing guilt, but about balance, about Lily's new drawing, about the small victories he hadn't known counted, sleeping through the night twice, saying no to an extra shift, laughing once without feeling guilty for it. As the session ended, Nora said, "You're getting stronger, Evan." He looked at her, truly believing it for the first time. "Thanks for helping me find the parts I thought I lost," he replied. When he stepped back outside, the air smelled like rain and possibility. And as he walked home, he realized something simple, something freeing. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was beginning to live again.